Alright guys, so now we have the function 3x minus 4. And we want to find the domain of this function. Well, before doing that, we have to first understand what is the domain. The domain is the set of inputs for x that are allowed in the function. So what values of x aren't allowed in this function? Well, this function is linear, and for linear functions, quadratic functions, and even polynomial functions, the domains of those functions are always going to be all real numbers. So the domain of this function is all real numbers. So we could just write that as all real numbers. And the same goes for quadratic functions or polynomial functions. The only functions that have a different domain that is not all real numbers are functions with radicals or fractions. So let's try to find the domain of the function 2x minus 3 over x minus 4. Like I said before, the domain of this function is not all real numbers. And that is because the denominators of fractions can never equal 0, because any number divided by 0 that's not allowed, because anything divided by 0, that is not a value. That's an error. So to find the denominator of this function, to find the domain of this function, we have to find the value of x that makes the denominator equal to 0. And to do that, we could just write the denominator over here. We could write x minus 4 equals 0. And if we add 4 on both sides, we find out that x is equal to 4. So 4 makes the domain equal to 0, and that is not allowed. So the domain of this function is all numbers besides 4. So we could write this as the domain as x cannot equal 4. And that is the domain for this function. So now what if we replace the x minus 4 with x squared plus 4x plus 4? What is the domain of this function? So remember, when we have functions that are fractions, we have to set the denominator equal to 0. So let's set the denominator x squared plus 4x plus 4. Let's set that equal to 0. X squared plus 4x plus 4 is equal to 0. And to find this, we have to factor this function. And if you guys know how to factor, you'll know that this is equal to x plus 2 times x plus 2, also known as x plus 2 squared. And now this is fairly easy. If we set x equal to negative 2, then this function equals 0. So the domain of this function is all numbers besides x equals negative 2. So x cannot equal negative 2. And that is the domain of this function. And the same goes for all functions with denominators as quadratics or polynomials. You just have to set them to equal to 0 and solve for x. So now, what if we have a radical function? Let's say square root of 3x plus 7. How would we find the domain of this function? Well, remember, radicals always have to be greater than 0. The value of radicals have to be greater than 0, because remember, the square root of anything has to be greater or equal to 0. So let's ignore the radical sign for now, and let's just write this as 3x plus 7 is greater or equal to 0, because it has to be at least equal to 0, but also greater than 0. And now, although this is right, we can simplify this a bit. We could also say that the value that x has to be greater or equal to negative 7 over 3. Because what value of 3x plus 7, what value of x makes the function 3x plus 7 equal to 0? Negative 7 over 3. And 3x plus 7 has to be greater or equal to 0. So that means x has to be greater than equal to negative 7 over 3 for it to be greater or equal to 0. Because if we put in negative 7 over 3 as x, the function equals 0. So this is the domain of this radical function.